So Kaddish.
Yeah.
Anita, tell us, what is the Mourners Kaddish?
Well, the Mourners Kaddish is a very ancient prayer. There are many Kaddishes. Actually, there are 5 different Kaddishes that you say in certain parts of a service. It's like a punctuation in a service. There's a Kaddish you say after study. The Mourners Kaddish is said in every service. It ends most services. It is probably the most familiar prayer that's longer than a blessing, than a 2-sentence blessing for Jews who don't know Hebrew, who've never heard it before. Even for people who aren't Jewish, the word Kaddish has some meaning, and it's like a chuppah in a way. The chuppah is the sign of the wedding, and Shiva and covering mirrors is the sign of a funeral, of a death in the house. In terms of what is spoken ritually, there's the Kaddish. And Kaddish, people know Kaddish who don't know Hebrew, who just memorize it because of the sound of it. Kaddish was written in Aramaic so that people who didn't know Hebrew would be able to say it. It was supposed to be in the vernacular. It was a really important prayer, which is kind of funny now, since people nobody knows Aramaic. And if it was in Hebrew, it would be easier. But the fact that the rabbis wanted it to be accessible to everybody, to people who were not scholars, is a very interesting fact. So it goes way back. It's very deep, and I think it's kind of musical too. I think there's a kind of a rhythm to it and a heartbeat to it, and that even if you don't know what's happening in a service, when people get up, they say the Mourners Kaddish, people get up. And they're saying that you can feel the temperature in the room change if you're in a synagogue, that this is a serious moment of silence, of intentionality and comfort. So it's a very multidimensional prayer. It's an experience. I think of it as a kind of heartbeat. It's got a kind of da-dun, 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 da-dun melody to it. And I think the sound of it is as important as the words as well. So there's a lot. I can obviously I could talk about Kaddish a long time. That's why the book is called Saying Kaddish, because that's kind of a signal that this is a book about death and mourning. You don't have to say anything else. You say Kaddish, and if you're Jewish, and if you're Jewish adjacent, what Kaddish is, and then the subtitle gives it all away.
Thank you for answering that question. Rabbi Robin, traditionally, for which relatives do you say Kaddish, and for how long do you do that?
So traditionally, and it's interesting, and I'm struck, because I'm always struck by the same thing. I'm just going to say an aside first that Anita struck by, is it was written in Aramaic, which was the vernacular, so people would understand it. And ironically, it's one of the things no one says in English. Like if you would say the essence or the intent is to understand it, you would think that would be the first thing we'd say in English in liberal communities. But the Kaddish itself has become so powerful that even though people who know Hebrew don't generally know Aramaic, we've kept it. And I think that says a lot about both the meter of it, as just well as the power of this amazing prayer. So traditionally, the Mourners Kaddish is recited for loved ones, and most people don't realize this, for just 30 days. And then after that, it's only for your parents that you recite it for a year. Now, I have to be honest, I have many congregants in my synagogue who say it for a year for a loved one who's not their parent, and I don't stop them. I don't say you're not supposed to say Kaddish for more than 30 days. If someone finds saying Kaddish and standing up for the Kaddish at the end of a service powerful, then that's okay with me, if it's providing meaning for them. And also just add something I said in an earlier segment, which I think is so important. We just all assume, we hear saying Kaddish, we hear those words and we think of mourning and losing a loved one. So even though it's one of many types of Kaddish, it is just so powerful for people. And whether or not they have any idea what it's about. Oh, I would say, so it doesn't even mention death. It's about praising God, which most people, I think, who stand up for the Kaddish assume it's this prayer about death and the death of their loved one, but it's not at all. But it's about praising God, and we praise God I believe we praise God for our loved ones. We praise God for the lives that they led and the relationships we were fortunate enough to have with them.
It's complicated though, Rabbi. One rabbi once said to me, if people knew what this said, they would never say it at that moment, because it's hard. If you've just buried a child, praising God is the last thing you want to do. And which is why the community says amen, because you can't say it. So it's a challenge too. If you get into studying it, why are we, it's a doxology. I love that word. It's so Catholic. It's a listing of God's attributes. It's praising God up and down. And that's hard to do at this moment.
And I would say our tradition intentionally does that. And,
yes.
I always say to mourners when we're saying, even when we're tearing the Kriya ribbon, and we praise God as we do that. And I say that's so counterintuitive. Yeah. And in fact, our tradition tells us when we hear of the death of a loved one, the first thing we're supposed to do is praise God. Yeah. And probably the last thing you feel like doing is praise God. But our tradition really demands of us at the times when it's hardest that we do praise God. Of course, we praise God for lots of other things. Traditionally, we say 100 blessings a day. So it's not like we're not praising God all the time for good things. But our tradition demands us in this way that feels counterintuitive to many of us. Praise God, maybe because we're not believing right now. Maybe because we really question, especially, God forbid, the worst situation, you lose a child. You may question your belief. And so our tradition says, go through the actions, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Just say it, and hopefully it will come in time. But you're supposed to do it even, and most especially when it's really hard and you may not feel it, and maybe some saying it and going through these actions will help you to eventually get to a place where you can really truly mean it.
So, keeping with the theme of serving all of our families, Rabbi Robin, who can someone who isn't Jewish say Kaddish for a loved one who is? And conversely, the same, can a Jewish person say Kaddish for a loved one who is not?
So like many things traditionally in the traditional community, the answer would be no. But in the more liberal community, I would say, again, Kaddish is something very powerful for Jews, as is very clear. And if you lose a loved one of any faith, I would say it's okay to say it. It's okay to get up and to praise God and to say these words. And, personally, I would think, why any less so for someone who happens to be of another faith than someone who's also Jewish? As far as someone who's not Jewish saying Kaddish, they may not be comfortable doing so, but if they're comfortable standing up at a service or reciting these words at home, even if it's reading a translation or a transliteration, to me, and again, I don't speak for all rabbis or all Jewish people, but I would say if they find meaning from these wonderful prayers that we're blessed to have, then they should go ahead and please use them.
I would just want to add one thing, that for somebody who's Jewish, and what constitutes being Jewish gets very complicated here, because if you care enough and you want to say Kaddish for somebody, you are in some measure living a Jewish life, or living with Jews, and it's part of your life too. It's not something you would just sort of like, oh gee, I'm going to say, here's an interesting prayer to say. No, it's about acting Jewish. It's about doing Jewish as a verb, as opposed to being Jewish. So if somebody wants to do Jewish in this moment, I would welcome them, and I would say, sure, come. Can I help you? Is there something you want to know about it? Can I help you? And I actually have nothing but respect for people who are living Jewish lives who have yet not made the decision to go to the mikvah, or make it quote unquote official, because that's our community. Our community is full of people who are living Jewish lives who may or may not identify or be identified as Jews. So it gets looser all the time, I think.
I think that's such an important point. When we used to use years ago the term Jewish community, it meant people who were Jewish.
Right.
And when we use it today, it includes lots of people of different faiths and backgrounds that are part of Jewish families and part of the Jewish community in all kinds of different ways. And again, we have so many wonderful rituals and things to offer. I'd love to share them.
Yep.